Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Make Politics Boring Again. If you joined us last week, you'll know that we're currently looking at the top 10 most significant elections of 2024. This week, we'll be focusing on the top 5, and then normal service will be resumed next week as we look towards the year ahead. For now though, let's get started with Russia at number 5. In March 2024, Russia's presidential election unfolded more like a carefully choreographed performance than a genuine democratic contest. Vladimir Putin, now in his 24th year of power, secured 88% of the vote in a process that was engineered to suppress any protest. Thanks to constitutional amendments passed in 2020, Putin could go on to rule until 2036, making him one of Russia's longest-serving leaders, alongside Stalin and Brezhnev. Officially, voter turnout was high, but allegations of fraud and voter suppression have made people doubt these figures. Alexei Navalny, who was Putin's primary opposition, was blocked from the process, and Navalny's death in custody under suspicious circumstances was an example of the risks faced by those who challenged the Kremlin. The state-controlled media played its role as expected by broadcasting a narrative of stability and progress under Putin, while sidelining any criticism and ignoring the growing discontent among the younger and more urban Russians. This calculated system is part of a broader strategy of survival in a world where Western powers have historically sought to isolate and diminish Russia's influence. The election took place against the backdrop of an economy that continues to be strained by years of Western sanctions. Since being cut off from the SWIFT financial system in response to its actions in Ukraine, Russia has been forced to adapt. It's pursued alternatives, including bilateral trade agreements with allies like China and India, the use of domestic banking systems, and it's even experimenting with cryptocurrencies in order to bypass restrictions. However, these creative measures have increased transaction costs and restricted Russia's access to foreign capital, leaving ordinary Russians to shoulder much of the burden. In the Kremlin's view, this economic resilience is not just about survival, it's about challenging a Western-led financial order that has long dictated the rules of global trade. Russia's pivot towards the BRICS coalition has become central to this strategy. At the recent summit in Moscow, Putin championed moves to reduce reliance on the US dollar by promoting trade in alternative currencies such as the Chinese yen, and pushed for a BRICS development bank to rival Western institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. For Russia, these efforts are as much about forging new alliances as they are about resisting a global system that many in the global south view as inherently skewed in favour of American interests. As Russia recalibrates its global strategy, its influence in the Middle East has waned. It was once a dominant force in Syria, where it backed the Assad regime, but Moscow's resources have been drained by the war in Ukraine. This shift has allowed regional powers like Iran and Turkey to assert greater control in the region, and now Russia is struggling to maintain its foothold. However, rather than retreat entirely, Moscow has leaned on the Wagner Group, a shadowy paramilitary organisation, to preserve its influence. Wagner operates in the region not just as a military force, but as an extension of Kremlin's strategy, offering security services in exchange for strategic gains. In Africa, Wagner has become a cornerstone of Russia's foreign policy. Its operatives provide military support to authoritarian regimes in exchange for lucrative access to resources such as gold, diamonds, and other critical minerals. This strategy has given Russia both financial lifelines and strategic leverage, limiting Western influence in key regions like Mali, Sudan, and the Central African Republic. However, the Wagner Group's operations have been widely condemned for their human rights abuses and destabilising effects on fragile states, further tarnishing Russia's reputation. For Moscow, though, Africa represents both opportunity and necessity, a chance to secure revenue streams and assert itself in the face of economic isolation. Russia's global strategy, often criticised as destabilising, is in many ways a response to its own geopolitical reality. Decades of NATO expansion, economic sanctions, and efforts to exclude Russia from global institutions have left the Kremlin with few options but to forge alternative alliances and resist Western domination. Its partnerships with authoritarian regimes and its leadership within the BRICS economic bloc reflects not just opportunism, but a calculated move to challenge a system that many in the global south see as perpetuating economic inequalities. This is not to excuse Russia's actions. Domestically, its authoritarianism is undeniable, and its military ventures often leave devastation in their wake. But understanding these moves requires viewing them within the context of a global order shaped by American hegemony and the West's tendency to isolate adversaries rather than engage them constructively. Russia's alignment with non-Western powers is as much a reaction to this dynamic as it is a bid to reassert itself on the global stage. Putin's re-election confirms that Russia is doubling down on its defiance of the West and its commitment to a centralised authoritarian model at home. Yet, beneath the surface lies a fractured society grappling with growing divides between rural and urban populations, older generations loyal to the regime, and younger citizens yearning for reform. Internationally, Russia's efforts to reshape the global order may bolster its relevance in the short term, but its isolation from Western democracies raises serious questions about its future as a stable and prosperous nation. This is not just the story of a single election, it's a reflection of a world grappling with competing visions of power, governance, and survival. As Russia navigates its path forward, the choices it makes will shape not only its own destiny, but also the broader dynamics of a rapidly shifting global order. At number 4 in our list, we have the United Kingdom's election. In July 2024, Britain turned a page in its political history as Keir Starmer's Labour Party swept to power, ending 14 years of Conservative rule. The landslide victory wasn't just a rejection of the Conservatives' mismanagement, it was an indictment of an era defined by austerity, Brexit fallout, and a hollowing out of public services. Starmer's strategy, drawing comparisons to Tony Blair's New Labour and even David Cameron's modernised Conservatives, played a key role in uniting a fractured party and appealing to voters disillusioned with Tory leadership. However, for many on Labour's left, this centrist shift felt like a betrayal, sidelining progressive values in favour of pragmatic compromises aimed at winning over the political middle ground. Starmer's early decisions in office have already sparked criticism, particularly among the voters Labour promised to champion. The removal of the winter fuel allowance for all but the poorest pensioners has provoked outrage, especially as rising energy costs continue to bite. Similarly, the introduction of inheritance taxes on family farms has angered rural communities who feel neglected after years of Conservative rule. Meanwhile, allegations of creeping NHS privatisation through the expansion of private contracts has reignited fears that Labour is continuing the neoliberal policies of its predecessors. Critics argue that these choices reflect a cautious and piecemeal approach that prioritises optics over the bold reforms Labour's campaign once promised. Starmer's government faces the monumental task of addressing the economic and social fallout of Brexit, a project that has left the UK fractured and adrift. His administration has begun pursuing closer alignment with the European Union, seeking to restore trade and investment by moving closer to the single market. While this strategy could help mitigate some of the economic damage inflicted by Brexit, it risks alienating pro-Brexit voters Labour worked hard to win over. Starmer's promises to tackle regional inequalities through infrastructure projects and economic reforms, particularly in the north of England, have sparked hope. But critics argue that these plans lack the ambition needed to reverse decades of neglect in communities hollowed out by austerity and deindustrialisation. On the international stage, Starmer's approach signals a return to Britain's traditional alliances, particularly with the European Union and the United States. His commitment to multilateralism and cooperation on global issues like climate change has been welcomed by allies, but contradictions in his policies remain glaring. Plans to increase defence spending, for instance, have drawn widespread criticism for diverting resources away from pressing domestic needs. For many, this reflects the same imperialist priorities that have long shaped British foreign policy, projecting power abroad while neglecting the inequalities festering at home. Labour's renewed global ambitions may bolster the UK's diplomatic profile, but they risk deepening frustrations among the very communities that voted for change. Despite Labour's decisive win, the election's turnout of just 60%, the lowest since 2001, revealed the depth of voter apathy. Many saw little difference between the major parties, particularly as Labour moved closer to the centre. Starmer's leadership has yet to convince disillusioned voters that it will break from the policies that have entrenched inequality and eroded trust in government. This growing frustration with centrist policies has left a significant portion of the electorate feeling excluded from the political process, raising questions about the legitimacy of the status quo. Starmer's victory has undoubtedly opened the door to change, but whether his government will seize this opportunity remains uncertain. Early decisions, such as cutting essential support for pensioners and cautious approaches to public service reform, suggest a reluctance to challenge the structures that have left the UK so unequal. For those who hoped Labour would finally tackle the root causes of these issues, the signs so far have been disappointing. Can Labour break from the neoliberal consensus that has dominated British politics for decades, or will it simply rebrand the same system under a different banner? Britain's growing inequality, fraying social fabric, and waning influence on the world stage demand transformative leadership. If Starmer's government fails to meet these challenges, it risks not just squandering this pivotal moment, but deepening the disillusionment that has already taken root. This is a quiet revolution in name only, unless Labour rises to the occasion and delivers the change Britain so desperately needs. At number 3, we have the European Union. The European Union's parliamentary elections in June were a pivotal moment for the bloc, as voters from 27 member states chose 705 members of the European Parliament to represent them for the next 5 years. This institution, the EU's only directly elected body, plays a critical role in passing laws, approving budgets, and holding other institutions accountable. Yet, despite its power, the European Parliament often struggles to connect with ordinary citizens, many of whom see it as distant and disconnected from their everyday lives. These elections were not just about selecting representatives, they were a test of the EU's ability to remain relevant to its people. The elections came at a time when the EU was navigating internal fragmentation and an increasingly unstable global order. Pro-European parties, led by centrist coalitions like the European People's Party, and the Socialists and Democrats narrowly retained a majority. However, in order to pass legislation, their reduced numbers mean they must now form alliances with smaller pro-European groups, such as the Greens and Renew Europe. This reliance on fragile coalitions highlights the growing need for compromise, but it also risks diluting bold policies to appease diverse factions. Adding to the tension was the significant rise of Eurosceptic and far-right parties in countries like Hungary, Poland and Italy. Fueled by dissatisfaction with the EU's handling of migration, sovereignty and economic inequality, these parties have positioned themselves as champions of national identity against what they see as overreach from Brussels. Their gains reflect broader frustrations across Europe, where many feel the EU's economic and political agenda favours wealthy member states while leaving others behind. This polarisation will make the new parliament an even more contentious space, further complicating efforts to advance ambitious reforms. Migration policy in particular has become a flashpoint in this growing divide. Populist parties have capitalised on public fears over refugee flows, framing the EU as incapable of protecting its borders or managing migration effectively. These narratives resonate in member states already grappling with social and economic pressures, turning migration into a political weapon. At the same time, the EU's united response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, once seen as a triumph of solidarity, is beginning to show cracks, as member states disagree on the economic costs of sanctions and the strain of energy disruptions. Together, these issues reveal the fragility of the EU's cohesion when faced with overlapping crises. Economically, the EU remains ambitious, with plans to lead on green energy and digital transformation. However, these priorities expose deep divisions within the bloc. Wealthier member states, such as Germany and the Netherlands, advocate for aggressive climate action, while poorer regions, particularly in Eastern and Southern Europe, prioritise economic growth and job creation. The election results reflect this divide, with support for green policies stronger in the northwest of Europe and demands for development dominating elsewhere. Balancing these priorities will be one of the new parliament's most significant challenges, as failure to do so risks deepening existing inequalities. Voter turnout reached 51%, the highest in 30 years, suggesting a growing awareness of the EU's influence on national and regional policies. However, this overall figure masks sharp disparities. Countries like Belgium, where voting is compulsory, saw turnout near 89%, while Croatia lagged at just 21%. Such disparities highlights the uneven connection between EU institutions and their citizens. In some states, the Parliament is seen as a critical decision-making body. In others, it feels like a distant bureaucracy. This variation in engagement underscores the ongoing challenge of bridging the gap between the EU and the people it represents. The 2024 elections reveal a European Union at a crossroads. While pro-European forces remain in control, their slimmer majority reflects a bloc increasingly divided by competing priorities and polarised political views. Eurosceptic and far-right gains signal dissatisfaction with the EU's current trajectory, while economic and geopolitical pressures test its ability to act decisively. Whether the new parliament can reconcile these divisions and maintain the EU's founding principles of solidarity and cooperation will determine not only its future, but also its relevance in an increasingly volatile world.
Please hold and we'll answer your call as soon as possible.
Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again.
At number 2 in our list of the 5 most significant elections of the past year is India. In April and May 2024, the world's largest democracy held its general election, drawing over 900 million eligible voters across 7 phases to decide the future of the country. With an average turnout of 67%, the election once again showcased India's democratic scale and complexity. Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP, emerged victorious, securing a 3rd consecutive term and solidifying Modi's position as a dominant force in Indian politics. For many voters, Modi's leadership symbolises aspirations of economic progress, national pride, and India's growing influence on the world stage. But beneath the surface, this election also reflected the deepening challenges of religious polarisation, social inequality, and concentrated power. Modi's win ensures continuity in India's domestic and foreign policies, with the BJP continuing to emphasise its record of economic growth and infrastructure development. Large-scale projects like expanded road networks, railways and digital connectivity under the Digital India initiative have formed the backbone of the government strategy, particularly in rural areas. Welfare programmes such as subsidised cooking gas and affordable housing have been key in expanding Modi's rural support base, especially among women voters who turned out in greater numbers this year. These policies, coupled with the BJP's efficient electoral machinery, helped to cement Modi's hold over a vast and diverse electorate. Yet Modi's time in power has been far from universally celebrated. His leadership has drawn sharp criticism for exacerbating religious and social divides, with policies like the Citizenship Amendment Act and the removal of Jammu and Kashmir's special status, reinforcing accusations of advancing a Hindu nationalist agenda. These moves have marginalised India's minorities, particularly Muslims, fostering an environment of fear and exclusion. Reports of increased religious violence and hate speech highlight growing divisions in Indian society, raising concerns about the country's unity and the erosion of its secular foundations. Critics argue that Modi's focus on Hindu nationalism undermines India's rich diversity and risks alienating large sections of its population. The BJP's dominance in parliament, reinforced by this sweeping electoral victory, has also raised alarm about the weakening of democratic checks and balances. Modi's government has been accused of consolidating power within the central government and sidelining key democratic institutions. Courts have faced allegations of government influence, media outlets critical of the regime have been restricted, and civil society organisations have been constrained under stricter rules. Investigative agencies and police forces have reportedly been used to target political opponents, further eroding the independence of institutions vital to India's democracy. With a fragmented and divided opposition unable to mount an effective challenge, the BJP enjoys near total control over policy making, leaving critics concerned about the concentration of power in Modi's hands. Internationally, his re-election solidifies India's position as a major global player. His government has prioritised countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific through alliances with the United States, Japan and Australia under the Quad framework. At the same time, Modi has maintained India's historic ties with Russia, balancing defence cooperation with its growing alignment with Western powers. India's presidency of the G20 has further elevated its global standing, allowing Modi to position the country as a leading advocate for the global south and a key voice in shaping international policies. This dual approach reflects Modi's ambitions for India to serve as both a regional power and a bridge between developed and developing nations. Economically, Modi's administration remains committed to the vision of self-reliance under the Make in India initiative, aiming to attract investments in manufacturing, technology and renewable energy. Infrastructure expansion continues to be a cornerstone of his policies, with significant focus on improving roads, railways and digital networks. However, rising unemployment, persistent agricultural struggles and widening inequality pose significant challenges to Modi's promise of inclusive growth. While welfare programs have helped mitigate some of these pressures, critics argue that deeper structural reforms are needed to address the root causes of these issues. As Modi enters his third term, his government faces the immense task of sustaining India's economic growth while addressing growing inequalities and social divisions. On the international stage, India's balancing act between global powers and its leadership of the Global South will remain central to its foreign policy. Domestically, the challenge lies in delivering on promises of economic progress while ensuring that democratic freedoms and social harmony are upheld. Modi's third term is not just about continuity, it's about whether his vision for India can unite a deeply divided nation or further entrench the divisions that have come to define his rule. Last but not least, on our list of the top 10 most significant elections of 2024 is, of course, the American election and the return of Donald Trump. In November 2024, the United States delivered a stunning and polarizing result as Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris by approximately 2.3 million votes, marking his dramatic return to the White House. At 63%, voter turnout was slightly lower than in 2020, but still historically high, highlighting the entrenched divisions within American society. Trump's victory reflected his enduring appeal among rural and working class voters, drawn to his populist rhetoric and America First policies. Meanwhile, urban and suburban areas largely backed Harris, driven by concerns over climate policy, social justice, and the erosion of democratic norms. Trump's second term is expected to double down on his signature policies, cementing his legacy as a deeply divisive leader. Domestically, his administration plans to focus on hardline immigration measures, further deregulation, and shaping the judiciary to secure conservative dominance for decades. His economic agenda revolves around slashing taxes for corporations and the wealthy, while dismantling federal climate initiatives and expanding fossil fuel production in the name of energy independence. However, Trump's continued rhetoric about election fraud, despite the absence of evidence, has already deepened public distrust in democratic institutions. Critics argue that his policies will exacerbate economic inequalities, while his divisive messaging inflames cultural tensions, leaving little hope for reconciliation over the next 4 years. On the international stage, Trump's re-election has sent shockwaves through global politics, marking a stark return to isolationism and unilateralism. His America First approach signals a retreat from multilateral cooperation, with long-standing alliances like NATO expected to face significant strain. Trump's preference for bilateral trade agreements reflects his transactional style, which often prioritizes short-term domestic gains over international stability. Tensions with China are likely to escalate as his administration imposes further tariffs and trade restrictions, while his ambiguous stance towards Russia raises concerns among Eastern European allies, particularly Ukraine. Trump's withdrawal from global climate agreements and his refusal to engage in cooperative global governance will make the US a disruptive force on issues like climate change, migration, and economic inequality. Economically, Trump's policies of deregulation and protectionism promise short-term boosts for certain domestic industries, particularly fossil fuels. However, these gains come at the cost of long-term economic stability. His focus on expanding traditional energy sources undermines global climate efforts, positioning the US as a barrier to international progress on sustainability. Trade tensions with major partners, including the European Union, risk destabilizing global markets and further isolating the US from key allies. Critics warn that Trump's approach prioritizes economic nationalism at the expense of the interconnected global economy, with potential consequences for supply chains and international trade relationships. The election revealed a nation deeply divided along cultural, economic, and geographic lines. Trump's nationalist messaging resonates strongly with rural and working-class voters who feel abandoned by the political establishment, while urban and suburban voters continue to align with the Democrats, emphasizing governance, climate policy, and social justice. These divides have only deepened under Trump's leadership, and his return to power suggests little appetite for addressing the root causes of polarization. Instead, his administration is likely to double down on the policies and rhetoric that have widened these divisions, leaving the country more fractured than ever. For the international community, Trump's return to power signals a period of heightened unpredictability. His transactional approach to diplomacy has already destabilized traditional alliances, with NATO and other multilateral institutions struggling to adapt to his erratic leadership. By withdrawing from global agreements and focusing on domestic priorities, Trump risks ceding ground to competitors like China and Russia. In regions like Africa and the Middle East, America's retreat from global leadership has already created opportunities for these powers to expand their influence. This broader realignment of global power raises questions about America's future role in the world and whether its allies can continue to rely on a nation increasingly focused on itself. As Trump begins his second term, the stakes for American democracy, global governance, and international stability could not be higher. His polarizing leadership style tests the resilience of institutions both at home and abroad, raising critical questions about America's ability to navigate an increasingly divided and unpredictable world. So there we have it. Those are the top 10 most significant elections of 2024. So just to recap, at number 10 we had South Africa, at 9 Argentina, 8 was Indonesia, 7 was Mexico, 6th was Taiwan, 5th was Russia, 4th was the United Kingdom, 3rd was the European Union, 2nd was India, and 1st, of course, was America. This list was obviously in two halves, so you can go back and check out last week's episode for the first half and let me know what you think of the list. Are there any that you disagree with? Are there any elections that you think should have been in the top 10? And there's now more ways than ever that you can get in contact. So we now have a website with a contact form. You can check it out at makepoliticsboringagain.co.uk, and you can follow me on Instagram at makepoliticsboringagain. So do get in touch. Let me know what you think of the podcast. Let me know if there's any political issues you want me to cover. It'd be great if you could leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast, whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on YouTube as well. Actually, we are also on YouTube now. Make Politics Boring Again is the name of the channel. Thanks again for listening. Do come back next week for the next episode. Look after yourself, and I'll speak to you soon. Thanks again.
Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make